Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Sonogenetics. Sonogenetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm really excited to be here today with Mavis Machirori, who's a senior researcher at the Ada Lovelace Institute and co-founder of the community interest group Genetics Engage. We're going to be talking today about the role of diverse and representative populations in genomics research, how we can do a better job at solving the issue that we've discussed many times in this podcast, which is the pervasive Eurocentricity of genomics databases and genomics research projects. And also we're going to talk about accessibility of digital health technologies more broadly, which is one of the things that Mavis's work is focused around. And we've had a conversation actually in the past on a webinar that was focused around this set of issues. But this was back in 2020, and a lot of things have changed. A lot of things probably haven't changed as well that we'll talk about too. But with that, I'd just like to say, Mavis, thank you so much for rejoining us, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Patrick. It's great to be here and, reconnect the conversation. Excited to think about what's changed and, like you said, what hasn't changed. So very, very excited to have this chat with you.
Super. I would love to start with your career. You started actually as a midwife, but then you over time moved into the policy and research side, and you've been doing a lot of work lately around this, major question about accessibility and representation in research. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that career arc and how you became interested in these topics from the beginnings as a midwife.
Yeah. So, oh man, that feels like ages ago. But my early days as a midwife, I think I was just happily going along, looking after, women and babies and their families, and really just having a great time. And I'd like to think I was also a good midwife, and wasn't, I suppose, at that time particularly thinking a lot broader about the ways that we looked after people. So I kind of went, what are the guidelines? What do they say? What's the protocol? And that's how I used to conduct myself as a midwife, so to speak. And then, you sort of start to think a little bit more about who are the people that we see in midwifery. Why are we, not seeing people with particular disabilities, physical disabilities? That was always something strange, I suppose, in the area that I worked at. How is it that, we don't see many women with hearing impairments? We don't sign, we don't learn to sign as midwives. And I know that other people do, right? So this is purely just my own, but a lot of midwives that I worked with would have these kind of areas of expertise, but I think we also lacked in other areas just in terms of our communication and our social understanding. But there's a time I read a paper by a midwife who had trained to be an anthropologist, and she was looking at access concerns of Somali women in East London. One of the things that I remember really sticking out was how the women in the group were saying, well, we want to come to antenatal care, but the responses and the feedback and the ways that the midwives interact with us already put us at a back foot. So these women had been asked, there was sort of a discourse that said women from these particular groups are not interested in healthcare, they're very fatalist. And what these women were saying was actually, no, we really are interested in, looking after our pregnancies because we want these babies. But what we're finding is there's the kind of infrastructure around the healthcare system, around antenatal care, that is making us not want to encounter these systems. Like, we're not wanting to speak to the midwife because we're getting a sense that they're already deciding that we're not interested. So they're not then putting the effort to come and talk to us. And I remember thinking, well, that's really terrible, right? Because as midwives, we're meant to be all-encompassing. We're meant to be as culturally appropriate as possible. But I didn't really think much beyond that. And then I did a master's in medical anthropology. And that, I think, was the moment that really opened my eyes, made everything make sense in terms of understanding cultures and understanding how people navigated the healthcare systems and made the decisions that they made. And so when I did that, I thought, oh my goodness, there's so much more to midwifery, but also to health. And, I won't say just giving birth because that's a whole complex issue, but more just about what are we talking about when we talk about health? What encounters make sense to people? And how then did these encounters decide and define the future experiences that people will have? And then thinking a little bit more broadly about the ways in which as midwives we were trained. And I'll give you one example of, I was already working as a midwife, and we have regular updates, right? We have regular updates to keep our expertise and our skills as evidence-based as possible. But that on the other side, we also did updates on technologies, the technologies that we used. And there was one particular time when we were being trained to use a new electronic healthcare record system, and it was asking particular questions that made no sense. And in a room, a bunch of midwives shouting, not really shouting in a terrible way, but having a go at the trainer saying, these questions make no sense. We would never say women, would never call our women patients, would never do these things. And there was something interesting in that which got me thinking, well, what are these technologies doing? How are they designed? And in that decision to ask a particular question, what's missed? In the way that we assume that a doctor makes a decision, what does that do to, say, the independence of the midwife? Because I think there was a question in the system that asked if the doctor had signed off the discharge, and midwives were really upset because we're an independent body of professionals, and like, doctors don't do that unless there's something wrong and they need to see the women. So there's something kind of happening in this space, I think, that got me thinking a little bit more broadly about what is going on at this interface of clinical practice and databases and technology, and how is it channeling and influencing the ways that communities and people in communities are experiencing healthcare?
Yeah, and it's an very interesting point that you raised about almost like a customer-centric or user-centric design attitude that is often missing in digital health for strange reasons, right? We should think about our customers, which are the people who are using the system at the end of the day, but very often they're built in isolation, or they're just not involving the full set of stakeholders, right? Is that one of the core issues that you found, that we spend all the time focused on the science and the technology, but then fail to think as hard about actually how is this going to impact the broad group of people I'm trying to make a positive change on, and get their input on the design far earlier? What is that, right? And what other sorts of things are systemic issues?
I think that's a very big one. Scientists, for all the good intentions that we or they have, we tend not to ask, is this a good thing to do, right? Just because we think it's a problem, are we the right people to come up with a solution? But I think even just before that is it a problem, and for whom, right? I remember reading a paper ages ago about disability and how a lot of the things that we think people with disabilities are facing, actually, it might be just, if we change the way communities are structured, that would be a solution rather than trying to get rid of the disability. And this happens with people with hearing impairments. And this paper was suggesting, on the one hand, should we be teaching everybody sign language, for instance? Then actually we don't have to worry about, suggesting that people undergo genetic testing or antenatal screening if there's hearing impairments in the family. And that's a very simplistic way of putting it, because it's such a complex issue. But all to say, I think you go into the communities where you think there's an issue and you ask them, what is the problem that you're facing? Doesn't matter how well-intentioned we might be as researchers, unless we're, researching from our own lived experience as part of that community, we will never know until we ask people if this makes sense or not. So absolutely getting that input at the start, and then also in the design of the technology, right? So, okay, we've agreed that this is an issue. How do we go about figuring out the solution? And if we find the solution, how do we design an intervention? Having people throughout will just sense check the kind of assumptions that we might have about what good looks like.
Yeah, I think it's very well said. When you think about the issue of Eurocentricity in genomics research, and I'm quoting a Nature article from 2019 here, that 16% of the world's population come from have European ancestry, but that is nearly 80% of the participants in genome-wide association studies. And I think these numbers have changed a little bit, but not by much in the last couple of years. When you look at that, what do you see as the core challenge or set of challenges, and what might we be able to do to make some improvements there?
This is a big one, isn't it? I think it touches on so many different areas. First is the diversity of the population itself. So something that you're touching on, I think, is really key, that there aren't enough samples and enough participants from underrepresented communities. But that doesn't mean that that kind of research isn't happening in other countries, right? So there's the question of how do we tap into knowledge that already exists in other research areas that are outside of the UK and outside of Europe and outside of the US. So, people might know of H3 Africa, they'll know of 50, I think it's 52 gene, but there are, so many other initiatives that are happening with communities outside of kind of our Western bubble, where questions are being asked that relate to genomics. We're understanding the environment and how it impacts people, and the genomics tied in within that already happening. So we don't always, and I say we in the Western society, we don't always have to come up with the questions and the answers. We can just say what else is happening around the world and then go and tap into those communities. But for the times when we do when we do ask the questions, we also then have to ask, are we the right people? Do we have the right diversity in our teams to be able to understand what that question actually means and what the impact might be on the community that we then research, right? So asking if we've got the right researchers means that we then understand whether the questions that we are researching make sense to those people that we think are going to benefit from this. But I think there's also something that's happening that we're reading about more and more when we think about diversity in genomics. And this is about the categorization of people in these data sets. Everybody is trying to sort of broaden out along lines of ethnicity or race. And we hear on, the one side that these are all constructs and it doesn't really mean much. Categorization, we can open it up as much as possible. We can give people all the sort of different categories and different ways they can identify themselves. So what happens in the background with that data? Is it then just being collapsed again into something binary? We have to have, open communication about that and honest conversations about what exactly we're trying to do by categorizing people. And I think to then connect to the question of how do we make these data sets more useful, we have to ask, why do we want to categorize and identify according to ethnicity data, right? Is it because by opening up genomic data sets to wider underserved communities, it gives us answers about what's missing in Euro communities? Is it because it's actually going to help us answer disease and health questions that those communities are facing? And I think there's sometimes a disconnect. We collect samples and collect data from diverse communities, but we don't always give them back the benefits of that research. And so what you find is, and this is not new, but what you find is people then get tired of this extraction of information. We've been participating in some research, but we have no idea if our samples have been used or not. We have no idea what research questions have been asked on those samples. And if there have been research, we have no idea what results have been. Are the results significant? Are they not significant? So there has to be kind of a continuing back and forth with the communities that we think are missing, so that it's actually meaningful. If we want them to take part, why do we want them to take part? When can we expect the results that are going to be, fed back to them to actually have a change in their lives? And to that last point, I'll add, do we have the right infrastructure to support those research outcomes? Because sometimes we might identify really interesting research outcomes, but then the healthcare system isn't set up to then support those communities to address, the things that we found from research.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that feels to me like one of the big reasons. I think there's a lot of reasons why researchers don't take this kind of 360 approach and really make sure participants get value back. One of them is the healthcare point, but I think the other point is the infrastructure one that you made, that we find it more difficult to do than to just do the work in a silo. But that doesn't make it the right thing, right? If you were to design a playbook on how to do this the right way, what does it look like from start to finish, of how you go from picking the first research question that you start with through to actually making sure communities get the value back at the end of the day? Do you have some ideas on, if not a perfect playbook, what are some things that you changed about how we do it currently?
Yeah, not a perfect playbook, but for sure, embed yourselves in the communities, right? So we've decided that this is an interesting group to study for whatever reasons. Let's go in there and get to know the people. Let's understand the ways they experience the world, not just healthcare, but other social concerns. Because as researchers, our work should not just be about narrow focuses on health. We need to understand how we can also support communities to live better, right? It's not just going to be about genomics. No one can change their genome, although some people might argue that they can. But generally speaking, the majority of people aren't going to be thinking about changing their genome. They're more worried about, do they have access to clean water? Can they pay their bills? There's energy crises happening. So what else can we do in addition to the work that, that is incredibly important? What else can we do to add social value, right, to the communities that we're working with? When it comes to kind of the hard science, I guess my challenge for scientists would then be, okay, so getting to know your community is one. The other is, how can you support them? So can you teach advanced methods? Can you do something that will support the younger generation to be able to ask some of these questions? And then in that way, what we're then going to be doing is thinking about, so I guess, growing the talent, right? So when I was talking about diversity and who asks the questions, there is that, well, we're actually supporting that talent by giving them the tools to understand data methods or research methods or scientific methods. And so then once we're embedded in the community in these different ways, those members of that community actually start to trust us a little bit more, because they're not seeing us as just coming to take. And then it's also ongoing communication. Now, saying earlier, you go back, you say, this is where we're, this is what we're thinking. Does it make sense? Okay, so we move on to the next stage. What does good look like in this area for you? Discuss the results. Is this controversial? If it is, what makes it controversial? How can we change that? And then what policies do you want to emerge from this, right? It's not just about, I've done my research, I've got my results, that's the end. So, okay, well, so what? It's really important in clinical research to do, for instance, benchside to bedside. And I think in every aspect of research, whether it's, patient facing or lab facing, you need to have that as a kind of mantra of the reasons you do the work. And so you go back to the community. So how do we turn this outcome into something meaningful? Who should we speak to in your communities or in government or in local, health areas, to really try and make sure that the outcomes from this research resonate and change your lives properly, rather than just focusing on papers.
Yeah, definitely. Are there groups in the UK, for example, that you think do a really good job, or in the US, at making sure they're designing research programs that involve the whole community? I think you've highlighted two things here. One is there's important research going on in Nigeria by 54 Gene and H3 Africa and others that you've mentioned. But then there's also in the US and the UK making sure that programs aren't just in English, but are in every available language, so that people can take part in their native tongue and something they're more used to, so that people are embedded in the community and not just running Facebook ads with a one size fits all kind of thing. Who do you feel like is doing it well, and what do they do differently than some of the others who just kind of take the same old playbook and then hope for different results, but don't always get them?
So they're not actually genomics based, but there's a group called Liberating Knowledge, and they've been doing work within the NHS to help healthcare professionals be better at having discussions around the ethnicity data collection. And I think that's a really core and key way of embedding community-focused work into the way the health service runs. And so Liberating Knowledge worked with Understanding Patient Data to do some work around just better representation of underrepresented groups or minority populations, or Black and Asian minority ethnic groups. These terms are also contested. I'll just kind of caveat that by saying that. But they did surveys, they embedded themselves in communities and really asked, also using their own lived experience, right, of not being seen in the data, like, what could we do to change this? And so then going to the healthcare professional saying, these are the things that people in our communities are really interested in. Ask them, don't be afraid to ask, but what you need to do is, if you're asking a question, be ready to have the conversation so that the person understands why you're asking that question, rather than, are you just asking for the sake of curiosity? So Liberating Knowledge is a really good example that I think exists out there about how to take some of these concerns about data representation or underrepresentation and really turn it into something that's practical that, healthcare professionals can use. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, they produced a document guide just to support healthcare professionals have those conversations.
I was just looking at that guide in the background because I hadn't come across them, but it's actually a super guide. So shout out to them for this great work. Hopefully, people who work in this space are interested in it can go look at it, and I'll put a link in the show notes as well. But I think that's a great example. And you mentioned a point there that I actually wanted to pick up on, which is related to a review that you published in Nature Reviews Genetics in 2022 around actually maybe addressing a fundamental question about race and ethnicity in African genomics research. And I think you all explored the question in that review of the use of population categories in research and what purpose they even serve in the first place. We know that there's more genetic diversity within the continent of Africa than there is between one African population and an out of African ancestry population. So I'd love for you to maybe talk about that concept. What had you thinking about writing the review, and maybe some of the reception or further work that you've taken after, your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, that was I think the work leading up to that review was great. So a friend of mine were having a conversation like over many, many, many months about just, what makes us who we are. And I think in my experience and in his experience, we were not born in the countries that we're currently living in. And so we used to talk about, what does it mean to be an African person in Europe? Or what does it mean to be an African person in the UK? And then the conversation kind of came around to, oh, how does this experience reflect what is happening in, the genomic space? And the categorizations of, well, okay, so if I leave Zimbabwe, which is where I'm from, at what point do I stop being Zimbabwean, right? Or am I still Zimbabwean? Does my, for instance, microbiome or my genome reflect any of these migration changes? So we really started to think about, in genomics, the concept of the African genome is currently, as you point out, something that is being seen as the answer to a lot of questions. It fills in a lot of gaps in the genome analysis, for reasons that, migration started in Africa. And so a lot of kind of evolutionary change we can chart in that. But I think the thing that we found was a gap was, well, how does this translate back to issues of equity and solidarity and global health and justice, right? We can sequence all the data that we want from African communities or communities based on the continent. And I say communities based on the continent because that's where the question of, well, so what makes you African? If your parents are from, say, an Asian background, but you're born on the continent, and your cultural experiences are based on the continent, and then you have children, like at what point can they claim heritage? And there's something interesting that we saw informing these discussions because of slavery and migration in America. We know that a lot of people have tried to trace their ancestry, right? And we saw some high-profile people going to African countries and being given sort of, oh, welcome back. And so we were saying, wow, okay, we know that the experiences of being Black American or African American is very different to being Black African. But when you look phenotypically, people might see you as the same. So, what does that mean? And so you start to kind of get into this rabbit hole of how do you even then marry this with what we're finding in the genome analyses of people from different communities? And so what does that mean, right? Is there even something that we can say meaningfully about, well, if you're, African American, claiming heritage on the continent, this is what we see, but actually that doesn't change the way you've experienced being Black or being Black African, especially when it comes to things like racism and, discrimination and biases and inequalities in society. And so we also know that the concept of the African genome is, a lot of money is being thrown at it, but at the same time, the continent remains really poor, right? It still has some of the worst health outcomes. So there's a bit of angst, I think, that was emerging from that, like, oh, this is all political in the end. And how do we marry the science with the politics? And so then thinking about, well, what is the African genome from the perspective of people on the continent? And so we had a workshop at Stellenbosch University, and this was part of Point Sud program, which is the group that funded our work. And it was a multidisciplinary discussion with about 25 of us from different angles, right? To say, well, okay, so social scientists, I think we sometimes are very gung-ho about, oh no, it has to be about social justice and you need to be inclusive, but also forgetting that, yes, the concept of African genome has these connotations and ties with it, but there are people who are still on the continent who need to earn a living and who need to work with that concept, who need to be embedded in the global community of genomics, right? So when you start to think about it, our colleagues in the group were saying, yes, that's great, but as a scientist myself, this concept is really useful for me to engage not just with members of my community, but with other researchers across the globe. And that only left us with more answers, more questions than answers, so to speak. Because then how do you take this concept that means so many different things to different disciplines, but has a tangible impact on, communities that are being researched? So all to say, we had no answers, but we had more questions about what does it mean. And then the final point I'll say around that concept is, we talk about ethnicity in the UK. The US talks about race more than it does about ethnicity. That concept is not really the same in African countries. We don't really talk about ethnicity. Some people do. Some people talk about tribes. Some people talk about, ethno-linguistic groups. And so there are all of these different terms that are emerging. Where in that do we, create these boundaries of what is scientific and what isn't?
Right. Yeah, that's super interesting. So if you were designing a research project in Zimbabwe, for example, how would you think about asking that kind of question, or what would you word it like?
That's such a good question. I think one of the first things is just understanding the different cultural groups that exist. And also the important thing is understanding the politics of why those groups exist in the way they do. Because going in blindly and just asking people about, oh, tell me, what ethnic group you belong to, or, what cultural group you belong to, and pretending that there isn't a history of that, I think you're actually going to create more harm, right? So understanding, first of all, how we've got to have these different groups that we have in Zim. And Zim has a very fraught political history, especially after independence, that, people still haven't really grappled with. And so if I was to go and to do a genomic study, I think first of all would just be being really clear about how am I going to be acknowledging these political concerns that these potential different groupings have experienced, and then to what end, right? What is the question that I need to ask that demands that I categorize people in this way? And it might be actually that I find out that maybe there isn't a kind of scientific reason for me to ask people to be categorized in that way, but think a little bit more broadly about what is it that unifies communities? What is it that is at the core of, health concerns or discrimination or biases, and then figuring it out that way. Yeah. But sometimes you do have to categorize, but you just need to be clear about how you're doing it and why.
Yeah, I think it's such a great and interesting point, because what you're saying is you need to think really carefully about the kind of questions you ask and why you're asking them, because everyone, goes through these surveys and they ask questions about race or ethnicity, and the boxes never make sense to a lot of people. They're like, I don't fit in any of these, or I fit in multiple of these. And at the end of the day, someone uses it to color a dot plot or something that doesn't really serve a major purpose in a lot of papers. So it's a really important question of just asking, like, look, what are we actually trying to achieve here? And maybe it's trying to understand something about how that cultural identity in the country shapes practices in some way that could have an interaction with the genome. But then maybe ask that question. Don't ask
absolutely.
it in such a
absolutely. Yeah, no, completely. I really like what you're saying, because then understanding those political differences, exactly like you're saying, means that some people have access, right, to care, and some people don't. And if we're thinking of, changes in the genome and epigenetics and all of that, then maybe that gets us, inscribed, I don't know if that's the right word, onto our genes that is expressed differently. But trying to figure out exactly why some people have access and don't means that you do have to engage with these differences. And yeah, that's great. And there's a recent paper also in Nature that has created a little bit of controversy. And I think the intent has not been the same as how it's been received, right? And this was the paper with all of us research looking at.
Ask about that.
Yeah. And I mean, or like I suppose looking at it, I'm just like, wow, this is a minefield. The only thing that gets me thinking is maybe we're trying to bring together two fields that are just never going to come together, right?
Yeah, could you explain that controversy a little bit? Because I think I've been watching it unfold on Twitter and trying to make sense of it as well. So I'd love to have your perspective of it.
I don't know if I'll do this justice, and I'll try and keep it simple because I don't think I quite understand the science of it. But from what I gather, so All of Us Research is this major program in the US that's been running for quite a few years now and has been doing really, really well in terms of getting underserved populations to participate in genomic research, asking different health questions. But this paper has tried to explain the genomic diversity of their participants. And then they, I think, overlay that or connected it to the social cultural diversity of their participants. And what seems to have happened, especially even in the choice of graphs that they used to show this kind of overlap, has suggested that the sort of ethnocultural is the same as the genome slash race slash science side. And there's been huge pushback on that because like, well, actually, we've known for a long time that race, ethnicity, and science are not the same. They don't mean the same thing. And so it goes back to that earlier point I was saying of, we can ask people to categorize themselves in so many different ways, but what's happening in the background is potentially this collapse of categories. And then that, takes you down into the racialization of people, which we also know is very controversial. And many, I think, now agree that is a social construct itself. And we use different words when ultimately maybe we're just saying the same thing. So that is sort of, I guess, top-heading controversy is, the ways in which they've decided to talk about these categories and how they're overlapping versus the ways they've then graphed and made a visual representation of it. But others with a much more scientific background will be able to explore it a little bit more. The people on Twitter actually who have really good threads to explain this, and I think from Columbia University and colleagues, Sandra Jindu from Columbia and other colleagues have written about some of the concerns around this ethnicity mapping. So happy to share that with you.
Oh, interesting. Is that Sandra Sujin Lee?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. I'll link to one of her tweet threads in the
absolutely. Yeah.
I'm just finding it here. Yeah, it is like you say. It's a minefield, and often sometimes intentions are not good, but most of the time intentions are very good with these things, and people are just not on the same page about how to do it, right? And we need to help as a field to figure it out.
Yeah, and I think the intentions, piece is really important because most people in science have really good intentions, but somehow either not being aware of what other ways, these concepts are being spoken about outside of our circles can then lead to these unintended consequences. I don't think most scientists would be ignoring it, but then it might be that they're aware of it, but then don't really see how it kind of influences their work until they put it out, and then there is this backlash. And one of the ways to solve that is more interdisciplinary discussion, right, about what these concepts might mean and how people might be experiencing them. And I'm not to say that this is not what the authors did, but just broadly speaking, this is what could happen.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a program that's been under the spotlight for a long time and has had a big focus on this. So understandably, I think people are looking very closely at the first major landmark paper, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I was interested to recap as well something that I think you've said a couple times across the podcast, which I think is really important, which is when there's a focus on inclusive genomics research or other research more broadly, there's very often multiple objectives in mind, one of which might be just simply doing better science. We want to understand the genome of the world, and we want to have absolutely as much diversity as possible so we learn more, right? And that's a very noble aim. But then there's a different aim, sometimes conflicting, which is we want to deliver better healthcare to people, and we want to make sure if a discovery is made that when it's implemented in a healthcare system, it isn't that the only discoveries available are those for people of a particular population and not for others. And I think it's important to really be clear about what objectives we have when trying to solve this problem, because you would solve those in two very different ways, right? The first one needs to be solved by collaborating with people in African countries. The first one actually needs to happen in the UK health system, right? And so the solutions are very different. Have I got that right?
Oh, yeah, Patrick, this is absolutely it, right? I would say also that it's so multifaceted. So it's about the funding, right? What's being funded, where's the funding going, and are the people who are requesting funds able to ask the questions that they really want to? And I say this cynically, right? Because sometimes the things that you really want to ask are not the things that get funded. So you sort of have
Yes.
to change your focus and go, but I really want the money. And then I'll try and shoehorn the other things that are of interest. And so there's a question and a challenge to funders, like how much hold do you actually have or do you need to have to make sure that then there is kind of more global equity, right? Instead of saying, well, you should ask these questions because they're of interest. Well, interest to whom? To US funders or to you as scientists or to the communities that you are meant to be serving with the funding that you give out. So that's one. And then, there's the others, which others have spoken about in terms of just increasing diversity in STEM. So in science and technology, engineering and mathematics, but also in the arts, right? You can't have good science without arts and humanities, I don't think, because this is where the controversies eventually emerge. So when we think about science, we also have to think about, well, the creative ways that arts and humanities can help us to think differently. And then just, I think, elevating other scientists from underserved communities, be it in the UK or in, African and Asian countries, emerging economies. There's so much talent out there. How else do we elevate those areas? And then also just the sort of more broader question. Are we done with all the questions on health concerns in the world that we can now only just focus on genomics? Genomics is not the only, right? It's not the answer to all the questions about health. And I genuinely don't know how much, in terms of a percentage, genomic medicine actually changes health outcomes. And this is not to say we shouldn't do genomic medicine and genomic science, but I think we should also be honest about how much it actually changes people's lives. And in the meantime, what else can we be doing to support people to be healthier? Let's cut pollution. Let's think about our carbon footprints. Let's, stop climate change, because actually people will live healthier if we do that. Get electricity up in places so that people can walk at night and, don't have to worry about taking a walk and getting fresh air. So there are other ways that we can think about engaging better health outcomes that are not solely related to genomics.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. We've only got a couple more minutes here. I wonder if you could just finish up with something you're working on right now or in the near future that you're really excited about that you want to share with people, or anything you've done recently that we haven't had a chance to cover.
I'll tell you the thing that I think I've worked recently on, which is exciting, and that was the genomics workshop that we did in Stellenbosch. I think there was so much energy around this is really an area that we need to think a little bit more about, what is the African genome, right? And we barely scratched the surface. One thing that was interesting that colleagues spoke a lot about was how much of the categorization ties into colonialism and colonialist agendas, and how much of the ways that we currently do science reproduces some of those, but also how do we change that, right? And the questions around, if you are going to create a more equitable agenda, what needs to happen? And I think for many scientists on the continent, there's a frustration. This is my perception. There's a frustration that the playing field is still really, really unequal. One way to change that is to get African governments more embedded within research and really funding, homegrown talent, homegrown research, so that we don't always keep looking to external countries and external organizations to provide us with funding. I think that's one way that we can elevate our own homegrown talent and really make the kind of playing field a little bit more level. So there's a lot to unpick from that, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to do a little bit more in the workshops. I don't know when or if that will be possible, but if anyone's listening and they've got money to burn through their pockets, then hit us up and we'll have some conversations.
Absolutely. I can't think of a better thing to fund if you're a philanthropist or a funding agency and you think this kind of topic is important. You want to bring the brightest minds together to help solve some of these problems. I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I certainly learned a lot. I know everybody listening did too. I really appreciate it, and I hope we get to do this again. Maybe we don't have to wait 3 years this time.
I
We
really
can do it a
hope
little
not.
sooner.
Thank you. It's been really great. And we didn't get to talk about it, but I will also plug our interest group, Genetics Engage, where we've, spoken quite a bit about some of the concerns affecting underserved communities in the UK. It's had a hiatus, but we're hoping to restart it. So that's another thing I'm excited about. But it's been really lovely talking to you and catching up.
That's great. And we'll include the link to that. It's geneticsengage.org. How can people join? You run events in person, online. Maybe you can talk for a second about that.
Yeah, so it came out in the pandemic, so everything was online, but we started to think about how we can broaden it a little bit more. So thinking one of the things that we want to do is to pop up in community events where there are things happening and we'll just have a stand and get people to join us. But for now, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. We're definitely on there.
Amazing. Well, thank you. And thanks everybody for listening. As always, we really appreciate any feedback you have. For this episode, any guest recommendations? Mavis gave me a guest recommendation that I'm going to follow up on after the episode. And as always, just please, the thing we ask of you if you enjoyed the episode is share it with a friend or colleague that you think would enjoy it too. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time. That wraps up this week's episode of the Genetics Podcast. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our guests for sharing their valuable insights and experience. And thank you as well to our listeners, as always, for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's talk, the number one thing I would really appreciate from you is if you could share it with a friend or colleague who you think would enjoy it as well. We would also really appreciate if you could subscribe to our show and give us a quick rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Both of these things help us become more visible when people search for genetics and precision medicine podcasts. And we're always eager to hear from you. Please reach out to us with any questions or feedback on social media. You can find Cynogenetics on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit cynogenetics.com. Finally, a big thank you to the team behind the scenes who make all this possible. In particular, Amy Cousins and Sonia Shah, who produced the show, and James Pierce from Selected Frequencies, who handles the audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.